I want to take you back to Ecuador, 1956. There was a group of 5 missionary families that moved to Ecuador specifically to reach a particular people group called the Huarini people. They had a nickname, the Alca. I don't know why they had Alca. That doesn't sound anything like Huarini, but this particular tribe was a very violent tribe. They were known for their violence in response to outsiders. In fact, to this point, there was zero peaceful interaction with anybody outside of their tribe. These 5 families moved to the area. The 5 men, the 5 husbands, decided they were going to set up camp and begin to establish contact with the Huarini people. And so they do, and they move to this area. And they have a couple semi-successful interactions early on where they're just taking some food, some gifts, kind of humanitarian aid. But all of that changed swiftly. And on January 8th, this was 1956, all 5 men were killed by the Huarini people. Now, tragic, right? But what we see in response to that is an amazing story of perseverance, because the 5 remaining missionary families, the wives and kids, remained. Most notably, one of the wives by the name of Elizabeth Elliot, you might have heard of her, remained. And just a couple years later, her and a couple of her daughters actually were invited to move into the Huarini village, where they began to share and display and show the love of Christ to others, eventually leading to the very first convert we know, a lady by the name of Dayuma, who began to bridge the gap between her people and the gospel, who actually played a huge role in the translation of the Bible in their language. And now, half a century later, the Huarini people are known as a gospel people. Their reputation of violence completely gone away, now a reputation of openness and hospitality because of the gospel. Today, as we look in Acts chapter 14, we see Paul and Barnabas, and they're on their missionary journey. We're going to jump right into the middle of their missionary journey. And what we're going to see is an incredible story of perseverance and victory in the mission of God, even when things don't go according to their plan. And it reminds me of Elizabeth Elliot's journey in Ecuador in the mid-1950s. Here's the lens that I want us to look through as we kind of think through Acts chapter 14, is that an unwavering commitment to the mission of God cultivates spiritual growth. So if you like to take notes, I would encourage you to write that down as you go to your impact group this week. I want you to take your notes and your questions and talk about what is this unwavering commitment to the mission of God and how does it cultivate spiritual growth. And there's a big text today as we get to the third part of chapter of Acts as we're in. There's lots of narrative passages, so lots of stories of here and here and here. So we're going to touch base on a few of those things as we look at the story of perseverance leading to victory. It kind of comes in 3 sections today. First, we see perseverance in a place called Iconium, and we see perseverance in Lystra and Derbe, which were kind of like sister cities. And then as they return back to Antioch, their parent-sending church, we'll see perseverance in their return. Acts 14, verse number 1. Now, at Iconium, they entered into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Gentiles believed. So this is Paul and Barnabas. When it says they, that's what we're talking about. Paul and Barnabas, they go to Iconium, they go into the synagogue, and they preach in such a way that a great number, a ton of people, lots of people are coming to faith in Jesus. But, verse 2, the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So as they roll into Iconium, initially they see lots of success. A great number of people believe, but we've seen this contrast quite a bit in Luke's writing already. but not a but God, but instead but the opposition, right? The unbelievers. So Paul speaks boldly against them with a message of grace. I don't know about you, but often when I think about speaking boldly against somebody, I don't often think of that being a message of grace, right? But boldly, truthfully proclaiming the word of God as a message of grace. God backs this message of grace up by showing them and proving to them and giving them signs and wonders. This is a reference to miracles, which we'll see happen here in a little bit in Lystra. But here's what's happening is God is moving in such a way that there's no explanation for what is happening other than to say God is working, right? That's what a miracle is. And in fact, I would say that I pray this type of prayer a lot for our church. I pray this a lot for people that I know who are suffering, who are sick, who are in need of a major breakthrough. I just say, God, would you do something in such a way that we have no other explanation other than to conclude God did this. Right? This is the message of grace. So they're proclaiming boldly the message of grace. No other explanation other than God did this. But then we see some opposition to grace. Verse 4, but the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, right? Those were unbelieving Jews, if you remember right. These were the antagonists. These were the religious people. Some sided with them, some with the apostles. And then it says when an attempt was made by both the Jews and Gentiles with their rulers to mistreat and stone them. That's Paul and Barnabas. So the plan comes in, we're gonna stone them. Verse 6, they learn of it. Paul and Barnabas learn of it, and they fled to Lystra and Derbe. So they get out of there, cities of Iconium, and to the surrounding country. And it says, and there they continued to preach the gospel. Right? There they continued to preach the message of grace. This opposition, it was bad, and it got bad enough that they were ready to stone them, to put them to death, like we saw them do to Stephen back in chapter 7. So they bounced, right? They're like, I'm out of here. But as they left, they didn't just shake the dust off their feet and move on and say, nothing's going to happen, right? Forget these people. They leave and continue to preach the message of the gospel. They continue to preach the message of grace. So they go to Lystra and Derbe. And this is kind of where things get crazy. This perseverance that we saw in Iconium, now shifting to Lystra, Derbe, and things get a little off the hook a little bit pretty fast. Verse number 8, now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. In other words, he was crippled, it says, from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. He listened to the message of grace. And Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, Paul said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And he sprang up and he began walking. So catch the scene, right? This is the signs and wonders that we just read about. A man crippled from birth, and there's actually tons of parallels here. We see, if you remember right, all the way back in chapter number 3 when Peter and John were walking near the temple gate. And they see a man asking for money, and they say, I don't have any money for you, but what I do have. And it says, Peter looked intently at him, seeing that he had faith to be made well. And Peter tells him, stand up and walk. And it says that he sprang to his feet and he got up. This is the exact same thing happens, which is also confirmed all the way back in John chapter 5, when Jesus, at the pool of Bethesda, sees the lame man and says, do you wish to be made well? So all of these parallels, all of these connections happen, God affirming that this is the message of grace, this is God at work here. But what happens in verse number 11, and when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Iconium, which just by the way, this is a clue telling us that Paul and Barnabas didn't understand what was being said. Right? So they begin to respond. Paul and Barnabas don't fully know what's going on just yet, but they respond in Iconium, and here's their response. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of man. Barnabas they called Zeus. Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer a sacrifice with the crowd. So here's how the people react, right? They see this miracle and they put it into the only religious framework that they have, which is their Greek mythology, the Greek system of gods. And they're like, the gods have come down to us, right? This is a clue to us that tells us this is probably the first fully unreached people group that we have record of in the Bible. They have zero recollection, zero knowledge of the God of the Bible. Instead, what they do is put it in their own religious framework, and they call them Zeus and Hermes. Now, this might seem a little bit odd to us, but if you study Greek mythology a little bit, which wasn't mythology to them, they had a temple in that city. They had a temple to Zeus, right? And they had a priest of the temple who came there, saw what happened, and he brings stuff to make a sacrifice to Zeus. Now, why does all of that happen? Because in Greek mythology, there's actually a story, a book written named Metamorphosis, and it tells the story of Zeus and Hermes, how they came to the Phrygian hill country disguised as ordinary men. And what they did in their story in the Metamorphosis was they went from house to house to house looking for lodging and provision, and they were rejected over and over and over. In fact, the story says more than 1,000 houses they went to until they find themselves in the home of an elderly couple who welcomed them in and was hospitable. And when that happened, they changed, right? And they reclaimed the form of the gods, Zeus and Hermes, and they actually built a temple in that couple's house. And then they went and destroyed the other 1,000 houses who had rejected them. So with that in their background, that priest of the temple of Zeus is like, bro, this is happening, right? Ordinary men, they're coming, and they're probably Zeus and Hermes, so we need to welcome them and bring them in and show them hospitality and worship them, right? Otherwise, we might be destroyed. And so that's what's happening. It seems weird to us, right? But that's the background of what's happening. And it says in verse number 14 that when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, right? When somebody translates the Iconium of what's happening, they begin to understand what's happening. And it says they tore their garments and they rushed out into the crowd. They tore their garments. This was a Jewish tradition. Anytime that they would hear a blasphemous saying or somebody speaking blasphemy, they would tear their clothes as a sign of grief, as a sign of disagreement, right? And they cry out, and it says, men, why are you doing things? We are also men of like nature with you, right? Don't worship us. We're just like you. But he says, we bring you good news. That's the word for gospel, the message of grace. We bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, a God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Paul tells them in past generations, he, God, allowed the nations to walk in their own ways, yet did not leave himself without a witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven, fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Paul takes this opportunity, right? And he says, whoa, this is not me. Which, if you remember in our study, back just a couple of chapters, in chapter number 12, when Herod Agrippa was spoken of and praised, and the people responded to Agrippa's speech and said, oh, he's like a voice of the gods, right? And he received that prayer, those praises. Yes, I'm like a god, and it actually tells us that God killed him immediately, right? So Paul, in a similar circumstance, they're looking at him and they're saying, oh, God, like this is God in the flesh. And Paul's like, no, You missed it. This is not me. I've seen that. It doesn't end up well, right? But so not only does he correct it, but then he steers their attention to the truth of the gospel. He says, let me tell you a little bit, right? I'm going to bring you some good news. The things that you're doing, these are vain things. You should turn from them to the living God, the God who created everything and sustains everything. So he takes this gospel opportunity, and even though they hear it, verse 18, even with these words, the words of grace, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Their beliefs were so embedded in their heads, the opposition, the voice was so loud that they struggled to abandon their beliefs. But then the Jews come in. Again, think through this. Is when it says the Jews, we're talking about unbelieving Jews, the religious people of the day, not Jews as we think of Jews necessarily in our context, but Jews from Antioch, that's Antioch of Pisidia, where they've previously been and got run off. Jews from Antioch and Iconium, where they were right before Lystra, where they also got run off. They were about to stone them. Right? The Jews from Antioch and Iconium, having persuaded the crowds, they finally accomplished what they had set out to do. And it says they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. Right? Physical, literal persecution. Right? The stoning, which we saw again happen to Stephen back in chapter 7, not a painless thing. Right? Literally, people gathering around and pelting him with stones until he was completely unconscious and they presumed dead. And they drag him out of the city. What I would say today is not only was that persecution very physical in nature, because it was, but imagine the emotional and mental persecution both on Paul and the church. Right? He hadn't done anything wrong. Right? Paul was doing the work with which God had called him to do. He was persevering in the mission of God, yet stoned to the point of death. So feel the humiliation, feel the pain, the mental anguish and struggle. But notice how that humiliation, that failure, physical persecution, it didn't overcome, right? Instead, what it does is it unites the believers. Verse 20, but when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up. Paul gets up. And where does he go? He goes back into the city. And he entered the city, and the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. Right? And when they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, then they returned back to Lystra, the place of the stoning, back to Iconium, the place where the Jews came to stone him in Lystra, and back to Antioch Pisidia, where he had previously been run off. Right? This was perseverance all the way through, right? This wasn't like Paul just getting up and shaking the dust off of his feet. These were picking up the literal pieces, the shattered pieces. But we notice out of the ashes, this perseverance, this victory, not defeat. And they get up and they go back to Derbe. They preach the gospel, and many disciples were made. Like an unwavering commitment to the mission of God always cultivates spiritual growth. There's a shift here in the mission as they begin to return all the way back to their sending church in Antioch, right? A mission that shifts from evangelism to a mission of encouragement. It says in verse 22, as they return, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith. and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And then it says, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Like this, they backtrack through these cities, encouraging, with a message of encouragement. Those who came to faith, as you can imagine, were likely very dismayed, very discouraged, very worried, right? They were excited when Paul came. They received the message with gladness. They rejoice in the message and turning to the Lord. And then they see Paul pretty much almost killed, right? Stoned. But he brings a message of encouragement to continue in the faith, right? In the same way that in Antioch of Pisidia, he tells the people there to continue in the grace of God. He tells them to continue in the faith, and that through tribulations, through persecution, through suffering, we enter the kingdom of God. And then he gives an act of encouragement by appointing elders. Now, we may not always receive this as an act of encouragement, but appointing elders was an incredibly important step in the birth of these new churches and the planting of these new churches. It conveys, as we receive the appointing of elders, right? This is a biblical pattern of appointing or commissioning qualified elders to lead their local churches. They weren't dependent on Paul. They were growing in their faith to the point of being able to lead and teach and guard and protect and communicate the gospel and the church. This would have been incredibly encouraging to them. An unwavering commitment to the mission of God cultivates spiritual growth. So as we think through the story of persevering, right? I just noted kind of 4 keys, if you will, to perseverance in the mission of God. How do we have this unwavering commitment to the mission of God? 4 keys to perseverance. Number 1, I would just say, expect challenges and difficulties. Right? Throughout the story, this is what we see: challenges and difficulties. People rising up against the message of grace, against the gospels, both in Iconium and in Lystra. But we saw a pattern. This happened again in Antioch of Pisidia. We saw Peter. People rose up and opposed him in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, right? And in Antioch, constantly. So we expect challenges and difficulties. Listen, to think that the Christian life doesn't include suffering or hardship or opposition is to completely ignore the biblical narrative of the Christian life. When we are faithful, again, Paul hadn't done anything wrong. He was participating in the mission of God, doing what God had called him to do, and yet opposition comes into play. So we prepare ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. We expect challenges and difficulties. Key number 2 to perseverance in the mission of God: rely on God's power, right? Rely simply in God's power. If we go in under our own strength, I promise you we will be woefully underpowered. Here's what the Bible tells us about the enemy, about Satan. The enemy is a liar. In fact, Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 44, that Satan is the father of lies, the master deceiver. Job chapters 1 and 2 calls Satan the accuser. Jesus calls him the tempter in Matthew chapter 4. And here's the thing about the enemy. He wants nothing more than for you to think that you can be successful, faithful to the mission of God on your own. He wants you to feel like you can do this on your own, because when you do, you will fail. And when you fail, you will walk away. But But if we go in God's power, we rely on God to do the work, on God to do the miraculous things, for God to affirm with signs and wonders. God, by his grace, bore this witness. And we're actually told, and Paul tells us in Romans chapter 16, that the God of peace will crush Satan under the feet of his believers. Right? When we go in God's power, we have this promise from God that he will crush Satan under our feet. Not because our feet are strong enough or our feet are powerful enough, but because our feet bear witness to the power. Like Paul, we have access to the power by the Spirit. Right? We just have to let it be God's power and not our own. So we expect challenges and difficulties. We rely on God's power. Number 3, don't be afraid to correct misunderstandings. I've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit and do mission trips. We lived overseas. You guys know this. And in fact, next week, Stephanie and I are going to Germany tomorrow to check out a mission opportunity that we'll be pursuing for the church next summer. So stay tuned for that. But next Sunday, I'll be preaching at a Ukrainian church in Germany, a church of refugees that have had to flee their country. And as I've shared opportunities that I've had in the past, South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, I've had a number of people say, what makes you the authority? Like, why do you think you get to go to their culture and to their place and to tell them that their beliefs are wrong? Right? Here's what I would say. Like, we want to do it gracefully and in a culturally appropriate way, but we cannot avoid teaching the truths of the Scripture. Right? The reality is when we hear the gospel is confrontational. And here's what it confronts in us is our desire to do things on our own versus God's desire for us to surrender to him as Lord. Right? Because my way says that I can do this, I can figure this out, I've got it all, I know the plan. God's way says, I can't do any of this. Jesus did it for me. Right? It's not a do more, try harder. It's a surrender. Right? And we surrender to Jesus as Lord, and we rely on his power, and we let him do the work, not ourselves. Now, the gospel is confrontational, but not confrontational in the way that we often think. Right? It's actually, here's what I strongly believe, it's actually loving to tell someone the truth. Right? It's loving to say, hey, I think you're a little off base right here. In fact, Paul later says to the church in Ephesus, he tells them to speak the truth in love. You ever heard that? Right? Sometimes somebody confronts something in your life and they say, I'm just speaking the truth in love. Right? Now listen, this can be abused and has been abused for centuries. Right? This is not carte blanche access to just tell anybody what you're thinking, right? And just to say bluntly, hey, you're stupid, right? This is dumb. You shouldn't be doing this. And I'm just speaking the truth in love, right? This is not your opinion into their lives. We have to be careful, right? We have to do this in appropriate ways. We have to not forget that we're actually trying to communicate the good news to people, not just our opinion about their lives. So if we do communicate the good news, we're speaking the truth in love, the gospel will confront things in our lives that we misunderstand. Right? Ideas that we often concoct in our own brains, maybe based on tradition or history or family or what we heard on a podcast somewhere, and we're like, oh, I think I got this thing figured out, right? And the gospel confronts those things and changes those things. So we expect challenges and difficulties. We rely on God's power, not afraid to correct misunderstanding. The last key to persevering is to invest deeply in discipleship. Right? Invest deeply in discipleship. It says that as they returned, they strengthened the souls of the disciples. commit to strengthening one another. We do this at Impact in groups. We do it with our Impact groups and with our smaller, more intimate discipleship groups. We call Impact Discipleship Groups, or IDGs, right? And here's our model for the way that we do groups is not an out in front leader, right? We don't use the language that says, I'm discipling him, or I'm discipling her, or they discipled me. Rather, it's an arm in arm type of language that says, we are doing our best to follow Jesus together, right? In community with one another, strengthening one another, we're trying to follow Jesus as best we can. So we encourage, we strengthen, we learn from, and lean on one another, because following Jesus, persevering, it's hard. Right? And sometimes it's really hard. And the way that we act and the way that we live our lives, it begins to stand out. People look at our moral ethic and they're like, man, you're not using language like we're all using, right? You don't gossip like everybody else gossips. Like, you're not lying about things just to get ahead. What's the deal, right? We get to share and encourage and communicate the message of grace. But as we do, be ready, right? People will attack it. They'll make fun of it. They'll persecute you. And if you're in this for personal gain, bro, listen, you're gonna lose. You're gonna lose. But if you're only in it for Jesus, and you're only in it for the glory of God, then you will experience victory. So invest deeply in discipleship. Invest deeply, commit to raising up the next generation. This is exactly what Paul does as he goes back to these cities, the people that had come to faith and he had taught and they had grown, and he appoints elders, right? He begins to see biblically qualified men, and he elevates them and he promotes them as God has called, and he says, hey, we're gonna appoint elders in every city. Think about this for a second. What if you had the power to shape the lives of the next generation of leaders? What if you had this opportunity to sit down with 10 or 15 other future leaders? And what I would say is that if you're not aware of it, you have this opportunity right now. Like, as we sit in here, there's about 50 kids back there. And in 4 different classrooms, every single week, we have the opportunity to pour into the next generation, right? Kids, next gen, who literally absorb things like sponges. And I would say, as an educator, like, there's no greater joy than to see your students rise up and use the things that you've taught them. Like, I've had the joy of being a student pastor, and now I look back on some of my former students a decade later, and they have kids and they're teaching their own Sunday school class. I have a few former students who are in ministry right now, some people that have been in my discipleship groups who are pastors at the moment, some that are worship pastors, and I'm just like, man, it is so cool to experience. Right? You have that opportunity every single week, encouraging, teaching, talking with them, modeling Jesus to them. Like Paul and Barnabas, we are called to persevere in the mission of God. An unwavering commitment to the mission of God cultivates spiritual growth every single time. So as we do, expect opposition, rely on God's power, correct misunderstandings, and invest deeply in discipleship, because eternity is at stake. Let's pray together, church.